Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. We're going to look at chapter 2, entitled The Call to Discipleship, from the work The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a classic from 1937. This is a pastor in the Lutheran Church system, and he has a lot to say. This episode's subtitle is The Absolute Authority of Jesus in a Follower's Life. All right, so I hope you'll get a lot out of this episode, and we'll begin. Now, before we do that, I want to give you a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I'm going to give you a little more than I gave last time because I really think it doesn't tell you the full dynamic. So we're going to give you what I gave you last time, but a little more. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in Breslau in 1906, the son of a famous German psychiatrist. He studied in Berlin and New York City. He left the safety of America to return to Germany and continue his public repudiation of the Nazis, which led to his arrest in 1943. Linked to the group of conspirators whose attempted assassination of Hitler failed, he was hanged in April 1945. But let's take a look at a better, more detailed summary, and this is at Wikipedia. And it goes like this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, born 1906, died 1945, was a German Lutheran pastor, theologian, and anti-Nazi dissident who was a key founding member of the Confessing Church. His writings on Christianity's role in the secular world have become widely influential. His 1937 book, The Cost of Discipleship, is described as a modern classic. That's what you're reading. That's what you're hearing. And notice what the topic is. Apart from his theological writings, Bonhoeffer was known for his staunch resistance to the Nazi dictatorship. So did he believe in Romans 13 that the authorities above you are from God? No, he knew that this was evil and he could spot it, and he acted properly, including vocal opposition to Adolf Hitler's euthanasia program and genocidal persecution of the Jews. He was arrested in April 1943 by the Gestapo and imprisoned at Tegel prison for 1.5 years. Later, he was transferred to Flossenburg concentration camp. Bonhoeffer was accused of being associated with the 20 July plot to assassinate Hitler and was tried along with other accused plotters, including former members of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence office. Shows you there were other defectors inside the government itself. He was hanged on the 9th of April, 1945, during the collapse of the Nazi regime. Now, preparatory to talking about cheap grace versus true grace that he's going to deal with, he's redefining the term back to the way grace always meant in classical Greek and even in Latin. And it always meant merited favor. If I had to define grace that you would find in a classical Greek text, it would mean something you would merit. If I had to tell you something in Latin, gratia, what you would receive, it means grazie. In Italian modern day, you hear the word grazie, meaning thank you. It's meant for something you did. It's not for something you didn't do. So in Italian, we have an expression to deride people who think you get thanks for nothing. We say grazie per niente, meaning I'm not going to thank you for nothing. So that's the whole point. It's this word has been distorted because somebody co-opted the word, and those words are in the New Testament. Yes, I know what they mean, but they are changing the meaning of the word grace. And that's so different. The meaning of the words of Jesus is grace are so different. The ESV, a mainstream modern Bible, pretty good Bible too, most of the time, it can't even use the word grace any of the times it appears in the words of Jesus. Charis. They can't translate it because you would not make it. It would so be discordant with your understanding of the word grace that somebody else uses in the New Testament. That person uses it to mean you're saved by grace, not you're saved by faith, by grace, and not by works, lest any man should boast. That it literally makes the concept of earning or having to do something to merit grace as evil and pernicious and dangerous spiritually. But Jesus sees it the exact opposite way. So listen to these two verses. Again, this is to prepare you to accept Jesus as your only authority. You've, up to this time in your life, you probably have accepted this other authority that redefined grace to be opposite the way Jesus teaches. So opposite they can't show you the word grace in these passages. They translated it as benefit twice, credit once, and thanks one time. But here it is. I'm going to show you how it really reads when you strip it away. And it's in red, the word grace. Okay. If you love those, this is Luke chapter 6, verse 32 and 33. So if you ever need a reminder, just go back here. Yes, you'll see it this way with benefit. Don't get dissuaded. Remember the word grace is there, charis in Greek. If you love those who love you, what grace, what merited favor will that bring you? For even sinners love those who love them. I'm going to pause. So Jesus is saying, if you did exactly what a sinner would do, you love those who love you, what merit is that going to bring you of grace? You will receive no grace from God for that. Okay? Verse 33, and if you do good to those who do good to you, what grace will that bring you? For even sinners do the same. So we know that Jesus teaches this very thing in the parable of the sheep and the goats. If you are helping those who can't not help you, you give them water, food, and clothing, and other help. But they can't help you. They're, by definition, Jesus is saying they're poor and they don't have these things. So you're not looking for them to ever pay you back. The whole point is you're helping them altruistically, you could use that word, to help someone who cannot ever help you and you would never expect them to, but you're doing it because you're obedient to Christ. He's given you a command. It's a command that if you obey him, the sheep and the goat says you will be you call me Lord, Lord, and you do that, I'm going to send you to have eternal life. But to those who call him Lord, Lord, but do not do these acts, these merciful, loving acts towards the poor and the stranger, what happens to you? You're going to be sent to the same place, he says, as I'm sending you'll go to the same place that the devil and his angels go. So you will not be saved if you don't have merited grace. You see the point? And it's right here again. Could not be more clear. It's in Luke. And that message about the sheep parable of the sheep and goats is in Matthew chapter 25. All right. So I hope you understand that the word grace is so been perverted by this other voice, this competing voice that God allows. God allows false prophets in his own word to test you to see whether you love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And that means you have to realize that this perversion where Jesus can't even use the word grace and get it through to you. They have to change it so you can't see that he's using grace in a completely opposite sense than this other voice, because that would throw you off. You wouldn't understand. How could their grace have two different meanings? Because somebody came along and gave you the false meaning. The cheap grace is a meaning that was not true meaning in Greek, but this person redefined it by the verse you've all read in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Now, with that said, let's begin the lesson from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, beginning in chapter 2 at page 57 of his work, The Cost of Discipleship, written in 1937. And he's quoting from Mark 2, verse 14. And as he, Jesus, passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the place of the toll. And he says unto him, Follow me. And he, Levi or Matthew, arose and followed him. And then Bonhoeffer begins. The call goes forth and is at once followed by the response of obedience. The response of the disciples is an act of obedience, not a confession of faith in Jesus. How could the call immediately evoke obedience? The story is a stumbling block for the natural reason, and it is no wonder that frantic attempts have been made to separate the two events. By hook or by crook, a bridge must be found between them. Something must have happened in between, some psychological or historical event. Thus we get the stupid question, surely the publican must have known Jesus before, and that previous acquaintance explains his readiness to hear the master's call. Unfortunately, our text is ruthlessly silent on this point, and in fact, it regards the immediate sequence of call and response as a matter of crucial importance. It displays not the slightest interest in the psychological reasons for a man's religious decisions. And why? For the simple reason that the cause behind the immediate following of call by response is Jesus Christ himself. It is Jesus who calls, because it is Jesus, Levi follows at once. This encounter is a testimony to the absolute, direct, and unaccountable authority of Jesus. Pause. That's his point, this chapter. Jesus is the sole pastor, the sole teacher. Anybody who teaches you a different teaching than Jesus Christ is false. And you can't use somebody who comes along and robs the meaning of his meaning of grace and use that person's meaning of grace. You have to use Jesus' meaning of grace. And I just showed you clear as day what that meaning was. This encounter is a testimony to the absolute, direct, and unaccountable authority of Jesus. There is no need of any preliminaries and no other consequence but obedience to the call. Because Jesus is the Christ, he has the authority to call. Jesus is the only significance. Besides Jesus, nothing has any significance. He alone matters. Think about how pause. Think how profound that is. Jesus is the sole teacher, the sole prophet, the prophet. He is the one. We are being commanded by God as Gentiles to follow him. That's what Jesus is telling us. and yet we're not doing it. We think we have to follow some other voice who tells us to go down this road of cheap grace. And Jesus has this clear, even in Luke, a very specific meaning of grace that is merited and only merited, and there's no other way to get it. And if you do exactly what sinners do, you don't get any grace. Do you see the difference? I hope that you keep memorizing. Go to Luke 6 anytime you have a moment of doubt. Just read it again, but you have to add the word grace where the word benefit appears, and or the word thanks or the word credit. Just erase those and put in the word grace, and then you'll remind yourself of what is the truth of God's word, not by lies and not by cover-up words. We continue. When we are called to follow Christ, the Bonhoeffer continues, we are summoned to an exclusive attachment to his person. The grace of his call bursts all the bonds of legalism. It is a gracious call, a gracious commandment. It transcends the difference between the law and the gospel. Christ calls, the disciple follows. That is grace and commandment in one. I will walk at liberty, for I seek thy commandments. Psalm 119:45. So, and I believe he's not saying don't follow the Ten Commandments. He's talking about legalism, which is people who make up commandments. So the Pharisees were not keeping the law. People have this wrong idea from some other voice than Jesus. Jesus teaches you in Matthew 23:23 that the Pharisees were legalistic in the sense they made up their own commandments and they ignored those that really were the law. So he says, you're very good about tithing. Great, wonderful. But you know what? You neglect the weightier commandments of the law, the principle of mercy, and you ignore the principle of the judgments of the law, a section of Deuteronomy, and you ignore the word pistis, which can mean either obedience and faith. It should mean by default obedience, just so you know. Pistis was this fairy character in Greek literature. She was a daimona, and she was a very obedient to her masters, and that's how she was known, and that's how the word pistis came into Greek, and that's where we got the verb pisto, which means predominantly obey, always with the person, or believe in facts, but that's not typically how it's being used in most of the New Testament. But sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. You have to look at each context. But the other word there was mercy. They did not teach mercy. And what was God's mercy? Grace. How do you get grace in the law? Oh, it's right there in the 10 Commandments. Look at the KJV, look at Exodus 20, look at verse 6 of that chapter, and you will see God says, I extend mercy after the first commandment, before the second commandment. I extend mercy, I extend grace to those who what? Love me, and what else? Obey the commandments. And Jesus asked twice, both in Luke and in Matthew, records the same answer. When someone asks, how do I have eternal life? He says, obey the commandments, quoting that very passage, Exodus 20, verse 6, because grace is merited, not unmerited. Paul has given you a false grace, the cheap grace gospel. That is exactly what is going on in Bonhoeffer's text, although he is being very discreet and just focusing on Jesus, and that's fine. But you need to see the implication in your life, because clarity does help bring sanity back to Christianity and the restoration of the true meaning of the word grace. Let's continue. When we are called to follow Christ, we're summoned to an exclusive attachment to his person. The grace of his call bursts all the bonds of legalism. And that's the legalism of the Pharisees, by the way, just so we're clear. It is a gracious call, a gracious commandment. It transcends the difference between the law and the gospel. Christ calls, the disciple follows. That is grace and commandment in one. I will walk at liberty, for I seek your commandments. Psalm 119, verse 45. Discipleship means adherence to Christ, and because Christ is the object of that adherence, it must take the form of discipleship. An abstract Christology, a doctrinal system, a general religious knowledge on the subject of grace or on the forgiveness of sins renders discipleship superfluous, and in fact, they positively exclude any idea of discipleship whatever and are essentially inimical to the whole conception of following Christ. Let's just pause there. This sentence, an abstract Christology, meaning Jesus is God or Jesus is the Son of God or whatever that may mean, a doctrinal system, which is all these ideas of covenant theology, dispensationalism, all these strange things. And he's dealing with extreme Bultmann dispensationalism in Germany at this time, where Jesus doesn't matter. What his thoughts were is not important to me. Bultmann said, I only care about the ascended Jesus talking to Paul. That's all I care about. The Jesus of this earth, we no longer care about him. We once knew, he quotes 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16. We once knew Jesus through the flesh, but we know him that way no longer. He believes Paul means to say we should only listen to the Jesus whom Paul is talking to. But Paul, by the way, says, I can't quote anything he says. I've been It's outlawed. I can't say anything he's actually saying to me. That he tells us that in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 3-6. So it's a very strange thing. We have to accept Paul's word that every thing he's saying is somehow coming from Jesus, yet he can't quote him. But that's a whole nother sub-argument. But but it is related here because you're getting an abstract Christology, you're getting a doctrinal system from Paul, okay, and you're getting general religious knowledge on the subject of grace as defined by somebody other than Jesus half the time, most of the time, or you're looking at the word forgiveness of sins. But if you do this all in an abstract way and you don't actually apply any of it, it's just knowledge and gnosis in your head. It doesn't do anything. It renders discipleship superfluous. So discipleship means learning how to stop sinning. That's what Jesus said specifically in John chapter 8, beginning at 31-34. He says, if you become my disciples, you become free. And they don't understand that. And they say, we're not in bondage. And he says, yes, anyone who keeps sinning is in bondage. But if you become my disciples, you'll be free indeed. And he meant by getting rid of your sin practices, not by some magical incantation of facts that I believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is not a teacher of spells. He's a teacher of changing your life and changing your behavior. But I digress. Anyway, so that's what I think is his point, is that the abstract Christology, the doctrinal system, the ideas and concept of grace and so on, all these attention to these doctrines, these things that you know in your head, positively exclude any idea of discipleship whatever, and are essentially inimical to the whole conception of following Christ. How could that be? Teaching Christology, teaching doctrinal systems, teaching about grace and forgiveness. Why would that make discipleship superfluous? Because it's distracting you from what you need to be doing, following the commandments of Jesus. Jesus doesn't make it a commandment you have to believe anything about him, period, in the sense of being God or God's son. If it were, he should have said so. Why would he say in John 17, 1-3, the Father is the only true God? Why would he say that if he's God? And yet you're going to spend hours trying to figure out whether he's God or not God when he said the Father is the only true God? This is wasting your time. This is it is drawing you away from Christ. How about if you want to study the word grace and you're going to do a word study on grace, but you're going to include Paul from the New Testament and against Jesus, and you're going to find out, hey, there's 4 times Jesus says one way and Paul says it a totally different meaning. Hey, whose authority? And you're not grounded yet in saying, hey, I need to follow Christ. And so that would have been your whole solution. You should not have even read anything from Paul. He's talking totally contrary to Jesus. The minute you spot that, you go, I have to get away from that. I got to follow Jesus. He's my master. He's the prophet. He's the Christ. He's the Messiah. Everything in one. I need to follow him. Let's continue. So, with an abstract idea, he continues, it is possible to enter into a relation of formal knowledge, gnosis. He's telling you Gnosticism is not going to save you. You want to believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? The demons believe. James, more or less, is even pointing right at that passage. The demons believe, but are they saved? No. So that's what he's talking about. And you can become enthusiastic about it and perhaps even to put it into practice, but it can never be followed in personal obedience. Knowledge is not itself self-activating. It will you can have head knowledge, but you don't put it in action. That's nothing. That's the whole point. You've got to do something beyond just having this head knowledge. Christianity without the living Christ is inevitably Christianity without discipleship, and Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ. He is saying, pause, he is saying that we have come to the point, by all this attention to theology and Jesus's Christology and do you get grace or whatever, put Jesus's words in action. We have a Christianity without Christ because we don't have discipleship. And without discipleship, he's saying you can't be a Christian. And that's exactly what Jesus teaches in John 8. Again and again, I must insist you read John 26 to 34, 35, 37, and even read all the way to 47. You'll get the real picture. These are believers in Christ who he says you must be my disciples, become free indeed. And if you become free indeed, you'll be free of sin. You won't be practicing sin, and you'll become a son in the house forever. But if you don't do that, you're going to remain a slave to sin, and you'll be in the house for now, in the hope that you'll come to Christ to follow what I'm teaching you. This is what he's saying. Jesus is saying this but if that's where you stay, you'll be a slave and you'll never become a son. So you have to You have to make the steps of discipleship and get rid of sin in your life. That's what Jesus said. When you're practicing sin, you're a slave of sin. When you're free of that, you become a son in the kingdom. You see the whole distinction? And it has nothing to do with saying a prayer, I accept Jesus, blah, blah, blah. No, you actually have to turn. You have to turn. You have to just say, not just say it and have not head knowledge. You have to do it. You have to turn around. You have to have that spirit inside of you. That will lead to you being born again. That's where you become a son in the house. Now you can become a prodigal son. You can wander away. You can go back to a life in the world, and so you can be lost. But then you have to be born and become alive again, as the parable said in Luke. Anyway, Christianity without Christ. That is a very classic statement. He said, we have developed a Christianity without Christ. Bonhoeffer continues, Christianity, remains an abstract idea, a myth, which has a place for the fatherhood of God, but omits Christ as the living Son. And a Christianity of that kind is nothing more or less than the end of discipleship. In such a religion, there is trust in God, but no following of Christ. If you're a dispensationalist or a covenant theological person where most of Jesus' messages are derided as teaching kind of an obedience that can't be possible, it's just hypothetical, and can be ignored because we know we're sinners, we're never going to do anything right, never please God, can't do anything that would require mercy or grace or any of these things. You've just discarded all of these messages from Jesus because they're just impractical and impossible. But listen to what he's saying. Discipleship without Jesus Christ is a way of our own choosing. Discipleship without Jesus Christ. In other words, if you've made somebody else your master and your teacher and is defining for you what it means to be heaven maimed is really something you can't do because we're all sinners, and my all of my righteousness is as filthy rags. Again, and a completely out of context quote of Isaiah 9. I think it's 9. I can't remember. I have a whole video on that. It's so out of context. It's the most egregious out of context quote. But that's what people keep saying to you, and they'll just try to discourage you from taking seriously any commandments of Jesus. So what do you end up having? You're being discipled into something that's false, into a false teaching. So he's saying a discipleship without Jesus Christ is a way of our own choosing. You're choosing something other than Christ when you do that, when you accept a false version of Christian truth, of the truth about true grace from Jesus himself. Those 4 cover-up words have to be uncovered. You have to study Luke chapter 6 over and over again and say, yes, it means merited favor. I can see it now. Oh my gosh. It's the same thing as in Exodus 20 verse 6. Jesus has brought nothing new. What is new though is his words, his commandments. He's not changed the message of salvation from something that it was and is now a totally new thing. That is a false teaching. That is a false, and it's a lie. Okay. It's the lie of that person who's in our Bible. There's only a test. Tests are important. God can prove to Abraham, can prove to himself what Abraham really has in his heart by saying, I want you to go take your son and sacrifice him. And then at the last minute, he's got the knife over his son's throat and he's going to kill him. And the angel grabs his hand and stops him. He knew the heart of Abraham. That's how God's going to prove and test you too. Are you going to take and grab? Are you going to go in the wrong way and accept a false teacher named Paul? Or are you going to follow the true teacher, the only pastor, the Messiah and the prophet? Are you going to follow him and obey him? That's the test you have to go through. And anything less is to have a way of your own choosing. You're discipling yourself. You've given up on Jesus. You're following somebody who's not teaching you to follow Jesus. That's never going to help you ever. You need people who are teaching to follow the Lord Master Jesus and following his words. Bonhoeffer is a good starting point because that's what he's doing. It may be the ideal way. Now, this is interesting. What he's saying is discipleship that doesn't include Jesus may be an ideal way, meaning you might be idealistic. You may think you're doing the right thing. He says then next, it may even lead to martyrdom. You might even be killed or persecuted for teaching the message of a false teacher because people don't accept it, right? But what does he then says? But that type of teaching, this gnosis about Jesus, not his actual words, is devoid of all promise. There's no promise coming to you. In other words, let's look at this parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus could not be more clear. You call me Lord, Lord, you do what I say, you go to heaven. If you don't do what I say, you don't take care of the stranger, the poor, and the needy, and you don't give them the water, food, and clothing, I'm going to send you to the same place that I'm going to send the devils and the angels. That's what he says. Go read it. It's Matthew 25. It's a fantastic parable. It's a genius, if you ask me, besides all things. But you will have no promise from God when you have a gospel you've made of your own choosing and gotten away from where Jesus is. You will find the end result, not what you want. And then he says this: if you've chosen a gospel of your own choice, your own way of getting saved, not the way Jesus teaches you, but somebody else is distracting and pulling you away from Jesus, Jesus says he will certainly reject it. He's just going to say, cross it out. Another person who didn't take the test to test my words against somebody else and test me and test that person. And you will find Jesus consistent with Exodus 20, verse 6. But the other guy violates Exodus 26 by teaching you mercy comes without loving God and obeying his commandments. That's what the other voice teaches you. In fact, teaches just have head knowledge, have the knowledge of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and you shall be saved. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4. But now he's coming. His call goes forth. Faith can no longer mean sitting still and waiting. They must rise. So getting away from abstract faith and abstract beliefs and putting into action the reform of your life by changing and moving in the direction of the words of Jesus, his commandments. Go to heaven maimed or hell whole. That's Mark 9, verse 42-47. That's a good starting point. That will help with a lot of sins, all kinds of sins, or flesh, okay? So we are flesh and blood, but we have a spirit from Christ, and he will aid us. He will assist us. And if we are obedient and loving to him, he will take care of us, okay? But we have to obey what he says. That's the bottom line. This is the third of the 3 episodes I've done on Dietrich Bonhoeffer of late, and I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to recommend that you go to Amazon. If you're a Kindle, you have Kindle app on your phone, iPhone, and all your devices. It's a great way of buying stuff. $13. Is that the best $13 you can ever spend? Absolutely. That's one of the best $13 you'll ever spend on something that will change your heart and make you soft towards following Jesus Christ. And you want to do that. You want to make your heart pliable, that you will stop resisting the words of Jesus and calling the like Bultmann said, I don't want to know anything about what that Jesus verse said. I only want to know about the Jesus that talks to Paul. And yet Paul can't quote him. That's the irony of it all. All right. God bless everybody. Ciao. Bye.